April 1st, 1945. 25 kilometers southwest of Okinawa, Admiral Minoru Ota stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Yahagi, his weathered hands gripping Zeiss binoculars as dawn broke over the East China Sea. The morning mist was lifting, and what it revealed defied every calculation in Japanese naval doctrine. Stretching to the limits of vision, an armada of unprecedented scale was approaching the shores of Japan's most strategic island fortress. Ota had served in the Imperial Navy for 27 years, had witnessed the Pearl Harbor attack, and commanded ships in every major Pacific engagement since 1941. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he saw through those lenses. The horizon was black with ships, not hundreds, but thousands of vessels, stretching beyond the curvature of the Earth itself. Massive battleships and aircraft carriers formed the center of the formation, their gun turrets and flight decks clearly visible even at this distance. But it wasn't the size of the fleet that caused Ota's hands to tremble slightly as he adjusted his binoculars. It was what filled the spaces between those massive warships, packed so densely that the ocean itself seemed to have disappeared beneath a carpet of steel. Landing craft, thousands upon thousands of landing craft, stretching across 40 kilometers of ocean in formations so dense they resembled floating cities. Small landing craft carrying 30 men, medium landing craft loaded with tanks and artillery, massive landing ships that could deliver entire companies with their vehicles and equipment directly onto hostile beaches. The formations were so vast that Ota could not see their edges, even with powerful naval binoculars. They extended beyond the southern horizon and disappeared into the northern haze, a continuous mass of assault vessels that seemed to stretch from one end of the Pacific to the other. In the next 72 hours, over 3,000 specialized assault vessels would deliver nearly 200,000 American troops to Okinawan beaches in what would become the largest amphibious assault in Pacific War history. But Admiral Ota, watching this armada approach, understood something that would not be recorded in official Japanese war records for weeks to come. The Americans had not simply assembled a large invasion fleet, they had brought an industrial capacity so vast that traditional concepts of military planning had become obsolete. The Japanese had spent months preparing for this invasion. Imperial Navy intelligence had analyzed American tactics at Tarawa, where Marines suffered 3,300 casualties, crossing 800 meters of coral reef under devastating fire. They had studied the assault on Saipan, where American forces required 3 weeks to secure an island smaller than Okinawa. They had examined the brutal fighting at Iwo Jima, where 8 square kilometers of volcanic rock had cost the Americans 7,000 dead and 21,000 wounded. Based on these precedents, Japanese planners had constructed elaborate defensive positions across Okinawa's 160-kilometer coastline. General Mitsuru Ushijima had positioned 110,000 troops in carefully prepared positions designed to extract maximum casualties from any landing force. The island's limestone cliffs had been honeycombed with tunnels and gun positions. Artillery batteries were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across every possible landing beach. Kamikaze aircraft and suicide boats were positioned for coordinated attacks against invasion fleets. What they had never anticipated was the sheer industrial might that could produce landing craft in numbers that transformed amphibious warfare from a risky proposition into an unstoppable force. The Japanese naval planners had fundamentally misunderstood what they were facing. This wasn't just an invasion fleet assembled for a single operation. It was American manufacturing capacity made manifest on the Pacific Ocean, the product of shipyards that could build assault vessels faster than any military force could destroy them. Admiral Ota lowered his binoculars and turned to his communications officer. The message he would send to Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo would trigger a complete reassessment of Japanese defensive strategy, but it would also arrive too late to change the outcome of the battle that was about to begin. The Industrial Revolution that had begun in American shipyards 3 years earlier was now approaching Okinawan beaches in formations so vast that resistance seemed not just futile, but mathematically impossible. Behind him, on the Yahagi's bridge, younger officers began counting the approaching vessels through their own binoculars. After 30 minutes, they stopped counting. There were simply too many landing craft to enumerate, and more appeared on the horizon with each passing hour. What they were witnessing was not just a military operation, but a demonstration of industrial capacity that had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare itself. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The strategic importance of Okinawa was clear to both sides, but the implications of its capture extended far beyond its immediate military value. Located just 550 kilometers from mainland Japan, the island represented the final stepping stone before an invasion of the home islands themselves. For the Japanese, Okinawa was not simply another Pacific island to be defended. It was the last line of defense before American bombers and invasion fleets would be within range of Japan's most sacred territories, including the Imperial Palace itself. The island's strategic value lay in its geography and infrastructure. Okinawa's relatively flat central plain could accommodate multiple airfields capable of handling the heavy bombers needed to devastate Japanese cities. Its deep water harbors could support the massive invasion fleets that would be required for Operation Downfall, the planned American assault on the Japanese mainland. Most critically, Okinawa was close enough to Japan that American fighters could escort bombing raids and provide air cover for invasion forces. For the Japanese, Okinawa represented the place where they would demonstrate that invading Japan would cost the Americans more casualties than they could bear to sustain. The island's defense was designated Operation Tengo, a strategy that abandoned attempts to defeat American forces at the beaches in favor of drawing them into prolonged, costly battles inland. Japanese planners calculated that if they could inflict 50,000 American casualties at Okinawa, the political pressure in the United States would force negotiations for a conditional surrender that would preserve the imperial system. General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the 32nd Army on Okinawa, had spent 8 months constructing defensive positions specifically designed to maximize American casualties. Unlike previous Pacific battles where Japanese forces had attempted to stop invasions at the waterline, Ushijima planned to allow the Americans to land, then bleed them in a grinding battle of attrition among the island's limestone caves and ridges. The defensive strategy was methodical and brutal. Japanese engineers had excavated over 60 kilometers of tunnels in the island's southern limestone formations. These tunnels connected artillery positions, supply depots, and command centers in a network designed to survive heavy bombardment. Artillery pieces could fire from concealed positions, then withdraw into the tunnel system before American counter-battery fire could locate them. Infantry could move between defensive positions without exposing themselves to American air attacks. Japanese intelligence had carefully studied American amphibious tactics and calculated that the invasion force would number approximately 60,000 troops, similar to previous American operations at Iwo Jima and Saipan. Their defensive calculations were based on containing and ultimately destroying a force of that size through concentrated artillery fire and fanatical resistance. What Japanese planners never anticipated was an invasion force 3 times larger than anything previously attempted in the Pacific, delivered by landing craft built in numbers that staggered military comprehension. The foundation of American amphibious capability lay not in any single technological breakthrough, but in shipyards scattered across the continental United States, where workers who had never seen combat were building the tools of victory with systematic precision. While Japanese strategists debated defensive positions on Okinawa, American factories were producing landing craft at rates that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. The transformation had begun in 1942, when American shipbuilders applied mass production techniques to military vessels. Henry J. Kaiser, who had revolutionized Liberty ship construction, brought the same systematic approach to landing craft production. Instead of building ships individually by skilled craftsmen, American yards prefabricated components in specialized workshops, then assembled them using standardized procedures that could be taught to workers with minimal experience. The results were staggering in both speed and scale. The Higgins Industries shipyard in New Orleans, which had built pleasure boats before the war, was now producing landing craft at rates that defied traditional shipbuilding logic. Andrew Jackson Higgins, the yard's owner, had developed assembly line techniques that reduced construction time from months to weeks. His workers, many of whom had never built boats before Pearl Harbor, were now launching vessels that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. The Landing Ship Tank, or LST, had become the workhorse of Pacific amphibious operations, and its specifications revealed American industrial thinking applied to military problems. Each LST measured 128 meters long and displaced over 4,000 tons when loaded. The vessels could carry 20 Sherman tanks or 40 trucks, plus 300 troops with their equipment. More importantly, LSTs could beach themselves on hostile shores, lower their massive bow doors, and discharge cargo directly onto enemy territory without requiring port facilities or specialized loading equipment. The engineering that made this possible was both simple and revolutionary. LSTs drew only 3 meters of water when loaded, allowing them to approach close to shore. Their flat bottoms and shallow draft meant they could beach on any relatively smooth shoreline. Ballast tanks allowed precise control of trim and draft during landing operations. The result was a vessel that could deliver heavy equipment directly to combat zones without requiring the elaborate port facilities that had limited amphibious operations throughout military history. American shipyards had built over 1,000 LSTs by 1945, with construction times dropping from 8 months per vessel in 1942 to just 4 months by 1944. The Newport News Shipbuilding Company alone launched 140 LSTs during the war. Each vessel represented not just a single ship, but a mobile supply depot capable of sustaining combat operations for weeks without resupply. The Landing Craft Infantry, or LCI, provided rapid transport for assault troops and demonstrated American systematic thinking about amphibious warfare. Each LCI could carry 200 fully equipped soldiers and beach itself to discharge troops through ramps on either side of the bow. This design eliminated the bottleneck that had plagued previous amphibious operations, where troops had to climb down cargo nets into small boats that could carry only a few dozen men each. LCI specifications revealed attention to details that would prove decisive in combat. The vessels drew only 5 feet of water, allowing them to reach shore in areas where larger ships would ground on coral reefs. Twin engines provided redundancy and maneuverability in surf conditions. Armor plating protected troops during the final approach to hostile beaches. Machine gun mounts allowed covering fire during landing operations. Each LCI represented a complete system for delivering infantry forces directly into combat. American yards built over 900 LCIs during the war, creating the capability to land entire divisions simultaneously, rather than feeding troops ashore in small increments over days or weeks. The systematic approach to production meant that crews could be trained on one LCI and immediately operate any other vessel of the same type. Spare parts were standardized and interchangeable. Maintenance procedures were identical across the entire fleet. This standardization transformed amphibious warfare from an art requiring specialized knowledge into a systematic procedure that could be executed by ordinary sailors with proper training. The Landing Ship Medium, or LSM, filled the gap between smaller landing craft and the massive LSTs, and its development illustrated American willingness to design vessels for specific military requirements rather than adapting existing civilian designs. At 62 meters long, LSMs could carry 5 tanks or 60 vehicles while maintaining the speed needed to keep pace with faster elements of the invasion fleet. They drew only 7 feet of water, allowing operations in shallow areas where LSTs could not venture. 478 LSMs were built during the war, each one representing the difference between a successful amphibious assault and a bloody disaster on the beaches. The vessels could deliver medium tanks, artillery pieces, and supply vehicles directly to combat zones. Their relatively high speed meant they could make multiple trips between supply ships and shore during a single tide cycle. Like other American landing craft, LSMs were designed for mass production using standardized components and procedures. But it was the smallest vessels that would prove most decisive at Okinawa, and their development revealed American understanding of amphibious warfare's fundamental challenges. The Landing Vehicle Tract, or LVT, known to troops as the Amtrac, could carry 25 combat-loaded Marines from ship to shore and continue inland without stopping. Unlike traditional landing craft that stopped at the waterline, LVTs crossed the beach and advanced directly into defensive positions, fundamentally changing the dynamics of amphibious assault. The concept originated from civilian swamp vehicles designed for rescue operations in the Florida Everglades. Military engineers adapted the basic design for combat operations, adding armor protection, weapons mounts, and improved reliability. The result was a vehicle that could operate in water like a boat and on land like a tank, eliminating the vulnerable transfer between ship and shore that had characterized previous amphibious operations. American factories built over 18,000 LVTs during the war, a production figure that transformed amphibious doctrine. Instead of landing troops at water's edge, where they could be pinned down by defensive fire, LVTs could deliver assault forces directly into enemy positions. The vehicles could cross coral reefs that would stop conventional landing craft. They could traverse beach obstacles and continue inland to attack defensive positions from unexpected directions. The industrial statistics behind these vessels revealed the scale of American manufacturing mobilization and the systematic approach that made mass production possible. The Food Machinery Corporation, which had built tractors and construction equipment before the war, produced over 18,000 LVTs using assembly line techniques. Workers who had assembled farm equipment were now building amphibious assault vehicles, their skills transferring seamlessly to military production. The Higgins Industries shipyard in New Orleans became a symbol of American industrial transformation. Before the war, the facility employed fewer than 1,000 workers building pleasure boats and small commercial vessels. By 1944, the yard employed 30,000 workers operating around the clock in 3 shifts. At peak production, Higgins launched a new landing craft every 36 hours, a rate that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. The workers building these vessels came from backgrounds that reflected American society's transformation during the war. Women comprised over 20% of shipyard workers by 1944, performing jobs that had been exclusively male before Pearl Harbor. African Americans, previously excluded from skilled industrial work, became welders, riveters, and assemblers. Rural Americans who had never seen the ocean were now building the instruments of victory that would determine the outcome of Pacific battles. These workers operated under conditions that reflected the urgency of wartime production. Shipyards worked around the clock, with workers sleeping in dormitories built adjacent to the facilities. Quality control inspectors checked every weld and rivet, knowing that any defect could cost lives on distant battlefields. Safety procedures were stringent because injured workers meant delays in production schedules that measured ships launched per day rather than per month. The systematic approach to landing craft production extended to crew training and maintenance procedures. American naval training facilities taught standardized procedures for operating each type of landing craft. Coxswains learned to read surf conditions and beach vessels safely under fire. Engineers learned to maintain engines using standardized parts and procedures. Medical personnel practiced evacuation procedures using landing craft as floating ambulances. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the Joint Expeditionary Force for Operation Iceberg, understood that Okinawa represented the ultimate test of American amphibious doctrine developed through 3 years of Pacific warfare. The lessons learned at Guadalcanal, where Marines struggled to maintain supply lines across contested beaches, had been incorporated into systematic procedures for sustained amphibious operations. The disasters at Tarawa, where inadequate landing craft left Marines stranded on coral reefs under devastating fire, had led to development of specialized vehicles for reef operations. Turner's fleet assembled for Okinawa included 49 aircraft carriers, 18 battleships, and over 400 destroyers and destroyer escorts. But the heart of Turner's capability lay in his amphibious vessels, a fleet within a fleet that represented American industrial capacity applied to military problems with systematic precision. Task Force 55 included 157 LSTs, 119 LSMs, 43 LCIs, and over 400 smaller landing craft of various types. This armada could land 4 complete divisions simultaneously and sustain them with continuous supply runs indefinitely. The capability represented more amphibious shipping than had existed in the entire world just 4 years earlier. Turner could deliver more troops and equipment to hostile beaches in a single day than most nations could transport by sea in months of peacetime operations. The industrial statistics behind these vessels revealed the scale of American manufacturing mobilization. The Higgins Industries shipyard in New Orleans built over 12,000 landing craft of various types. The facility employed 30,000 workers operating around the clock in 3 shifts. At peak production, Higgins launched a new landing craft every 36 hours. Workers who had been unemployed before Pearl Harbor were now building the instruments of Japanese defeat. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the Joint Expeditionary Force for Operation Iceberg, understood that Okinawa represented the ultimate test of American amphibious doctrine. The lessons learned at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan had been incorporated into a systematic approach to amphibious warfare that emphasized overwhelming firepower and rapid deployment of massive forces. Turner's fleet included 49 aircraft carriers, 18 battleships, and over 400 destroyers and destroyer escorts. But the heart of Turner's capability lay in his amphibious vessels. Task Force 55 included 157 LSTs, 119 LSMs, 43 LCIs, and over 400 smaller landing craft. The Armada could land 4 complete divisions simultaneously and sustain them with continuous supply runs. This represented more amphibious capability than existed in the entire world just 4 years earlier. The Japanese response to intelligence reports about the approaching fleet revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of American capabilities and the systematic errors in their strategic planning. Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo initially dismissed reports of the fleet's size as grossly exaggerated, the product of panicked observers who had lost their ability to make accurate assessments. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet from his headquarters in Tokyo, calculated that the Americans lacked sufficient shipping to mount an operation larger than Iwo Jima, where 50,000 troops had required the largest amphibious fleet assembled to that date. This miscalculation stemmed from Japanese naval doctrine that emphasized quality over quantity, individual excellence over mass production, and spiritual strength over material abundance. Japanese landing craft production focused on sophisticated vessels built to exacting standards by skilled craftsmen who had learned their trade through years of apprenticeship. The result was landing craft superior in individual capability to American designs, featuring better armor, more reliable engines, and superior construction quality. But Japanese shipyards managed to build approximately 200 landing craft during the entire war, compared to over 36,000 American vessels of all types. The contrast reflected deeper philosophical differences about warfare and industrial production that would prove decisive in the Pacific conflict. Japanese military culture valued the spiritual qualities of individual warriors and the technical perfection of weapons crafted by master artisans. American doctrine emphasized standardization, mass production, and overwhelming material superiority, achieved through systematic industrial processes. Captain Atsushi Oi, serving as operations officer for the combined fleet, had spent months analyzing American amphibious capabilities and concluded that the maximum force the Americans could deliver to Okinawa was approximately 70,000 troops. His calculations were based on careful analysis of American shipping resources and previous operations. What Oi could not account for was the systematic increase in American production capacity that had made his calculations obsolete before he completed them. American shipyards were launching new landing craft faster than Japanese intelligence could track them. The systematic approach to mass production meant that vessels completed in March were not included in intelligence estimates prepared in February. By the time Japanese analysts incorporated new American vessels into their calculations, additional ships had been launched that would again alter the strategic balance. On March 30th, 1945, the first elements of Task Force 55 appeared on the horizon, visible from Okinawa's western beaches. Japanese observers, stationed in concealed positions along the Hagushi beaches, reported battleships and aircraft carriers as expected, but the subsequent reports that reached Imperial Navy headquarters seemed to describe an impossibility. Landing craft extended beyond the horizon in formations that appeared to cover the entire western Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Masao Yoshida, manning an observation post on the Motobu Peninsula with powerful artillery spotting telescopes, attempted to count the approaching vessels and quickly abandoned the effort as futile. In his final report before the position was overrun, Yoshida wrote, "The enemy fleet extends from the northern horizon to the southern horizon, and from the visible ocean to the distant haze. There are so many landing boats that they cover the sea like leaves covering a forest floor. Counting them is impossible. Fighting them seems equally impossible." Radio intercepts revealed American communications coordinating over 3,000 assault vessels approaching the island, a figure that Japanese commanders initially refused to believe. The communications networks established by American forces demonstrated systematic planning that extended to every detail of the amphibious operation. Landing craft commanders received detailed instructions for their specific beach assignments, timing for their approach, and procedures for coordinating with other vessels. The systematic nature of American planning contrasted sharply with Japanese defensive preparations, which emphasized individual initiative and adaptation to changing circumstances. American landing craft operated according to detailed schedules that specified their exact positions at 15-minute intervals throughout the assault. Japanese defenders, trained to respond flexibly to unexpected situations, found themselves facing an enemy that executed plans with mechanical precision. Private Tadashi Kojo, manning an observation post overlooking the Hagushi beaches, maintained a diary throughout the early days of the invasion that provides insight into the psychological impact on Japanese defenders. On April 1st, he wrote, "The sea is covered with enemy ships from one end of the horizon to the other. There are so many landing boats that they look like ants covering food. How can we fight against so many? Each boat carries 20 or 30 soldiers with complete equipment. In 1 hour, I count more than 1,000 enemy soldiers landing while we lose 10 men to their artillery. At this rate, they will soon have more soldiers on Okinawa than we do." Kojo's observations reflected the psychological warfare that American industrial capacity waged against Japanese defenders. The endless stream of landing craft delivering fresh troops and supplies convinced many Japanese soldiers that resistance was futile, that they were fighting not just an enemy army but an entire industrial civilization. The spiritual training that Japanese military doctrine emphasized seemed inadequate against an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. Japanese commanders recognized too late that their defensive strategy was obsolete, designed for an era of warfare that American industrial capacity had made irrelevant. General Ushijima had planned to concentrate his artillery on landing beaches to destroy assault waves as they approached shore. His calculations were based on engagement scenarios where Japanese gunners could target individual landing craft and achieve high destruction rates through accurate fire. But the sheer number of American landing craft made concentrated fire impossible. Even if Japanese artillery destroyed dozens of landing craft in the first hour of the assault, hundreds more would continue to the beaches. The Americans could absorb losses that would have crippled any previous amphibious operation and continue the assault without pause. Japanese artillery batteries found themselves overwhelmed by targets too numerous to engage effectively. The technical specifications of American landing craft revealed why Japanese resistance would ultimately prove futile and how systematic engineering had solved problems that had plagued amphibious warfare throughout military history. LSTs carried enough supplies to sustain combat operations for weeks without resupply from larger vessels. Each LST contained machine shops, medical facilities, and communications equipment that allowed it to function as a mobile base capable of supporting extended operations. LVTs could traverse coral reefs that would stop conventional landing craft and continue inland to attack defensive positions from unexpected directions. Their tracked propulsion allowed movement across terrain that wheeled vehicles could not navigate. Armor protection allowed them to advance under fire that would have stopped unprotected infantry. The Americans had created a completely integrated amphibious warfare system that made traditional coastal defense obsolete. LCIs could land troops directly onto hostile beaches while providing covering fire with mounted weapons, eliminating the vulnerable transfer between offshore vessels and small boats that had characterized previous amphibious operations. The vessels carried medical equipment for treating wounded during the return trip to larger ships. Communications equipment allowed coordination with other landing craft and supporting vessels. Each LCI represented a complete system for delivering infantry forces directly into combat. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding the 5th Air Fleet from his headquarters in southern Kyushu, attempted to coordinate kamikaze attacks against the invasion fleet, but found that the scale of the target presented impossible tactical choices. With over 1,500 ships spread across 40 kilometers of ocean, Japanese pilots could not concentrate their attacks effectively. Ugaki wrote in his diary, "The enemy has brought such numbers that destroying even 100 ships would not significantly affect their capability. They have made our traditional tactics meaningless through sheer abundance." The kamikaze campaign that began on April 6th represented Japanese recognition that conventional warfare had become impossible against American industrial superiority. The suicide attacks achieved tactical success, sinking 36 American vessels and damaging 368 others throughout the Okinawa campaign. But these losses represented less than 10% of the total American force, and replacement vessels continued to arrive throughout the battle. The first wave of LVTs hit Okinawan beaches at 8:30 a.m. on April 1, 1945, beginning an assault that would demonstrate American systematic thinking applied to amphibious warfare. Within 6 hours, 60,000 American troops were ashore with tanks, artillery, and supplies, a rate of buildup that exceeded Japanese defensive planning by several orders of magnitude. By the end of the second day, the beachhead extended 15 kilometers inland and included 2 airfields that were already receiving American aircraft. The speed of this achievement reflected systematic coordination that extended to every aspect of the amphibious operation. American plans specified the exact timing for each wave of landing craft, the precise beach assignments for each unit, and detailed procedures for unloading equipment and supplies. Traffic control personnel directed the flow of vehicles and personnel across the beaches using procedures developed through extensive training and previous operations. The logistics behind this achievement revealed American industrial capacity in its full magnitude and the systematic approach that made sustained amphibious operations possible. Each of the 4 assault divisions required approximately 1,000 tons of supplies daily, including ammunition, food, medical equipment, fuel, and replacement parts. The invasion fleet delivered this material continuously through a carefully orchestrated system of landing craft rotation that operated around the clock. Empty landing craft returned to supply ships offshore, while loaded vessels maintained a constant stream of men and material flowing across the beaches. LSTs beached themselves at high tide and discharged cargo while waiting for the next tide cycle. LCTs shuttled between larger ships and the beach, carrying everything from ammunition to medical supplies with systematic efficiency. DUKWs, the amphibious trucks known as ducks, drove directly from ships through the surf to supply dumps inland, eliminating the bottlenecks that had plagued previous operations. The Americans had created a supply system that delivered more material across hostile beaches than most ports could handle in peacetime, and they had made this systematic delivery routine rather than exceptional. Standard operating procedures specified exactly how each type of supply would be handled, where it would be stored, and how it would be distributed to combat units. The result was a logistics system that functioned with mechanical precision even under combat conditions. Japanese attempts to disrupt this supply system proved futile and revealed the obsolescence of traditional defensive thinking against systematic industrial approaches to warfare. Artillery positioned in the island's limestone caves could target individual landing craft, but destroying a few vessels among thousands had no meaningful impact on American operations. Each battery could fire on perhaps a dozen landing craft per hour, while hundreds more approached the beaches during the same period. Kamikaze attacks achieved greater success, sinking several LSTs and damaging numerous other vessels, but could not significantly reduce the flow of supplies reaching American forces ashore. For every vessel lost, 3 more appeared to take its place. The systematic replacement of damaged vessels reflected production schedules that had been established months before the battle began. American planners had calculated expected losses and prepared replacement schedules accordingly. Captain Tsuneo Shimura, commanding a coastal defense battery on the southern tip of Okinawa, wrote in his final report before the position was overrun, "The enemy possesses so many ships and landing boats that destroying them is like trying to stop the rain by shooting at individual raindrops. Our entire strategy was based on defeating an enemy similar to ourselves in numbers and capability. We are instead fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity has made traditional warfare obsolete." Shimura's observation reflected the psychological impact of American industrial superiority on Japanese defenders throughout the Pacific. Soldiers who had been trained to believe that spiritual strength and individual excellence could overcome material disadvantages found themselves facing an enemy that had made such calculations irrelevant through systematic mass production. The traditional Japanese military virtues seemed meaningless against an industrial system that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. By April 4, 1945, over 180,000 American troops were ashore on Okinawa with complete equipment and 30 days of supplies, demonstrating that American amphibious capability had made traditional defensive strategies obsolete. The speed of this build-up had made Japanese defensive plans irrelevant. Instead of facing isolated American landing forces that could be defeated piecemeal, Japanese defenders confronted a fully equipped army that grew stronger each day. The industrial achievement represented by the Okinawa landing craft deployment extended far beyond military significance and demonstrated systematic approaches to complex problems that would influence both military and civilian applications for decades. American shipyards had demonstrated the capacity to build specialized vessels in numbers that transformed amphibious warfare from a risky gamble into a routine operation. The systematic production techniques developed for landing craft would inform commercial shipbuilding throughout the post-war period. The human dimension of this achievement deserves recognition alongside its technical and strategic significance. Welders in New Orleans shipyards worked around the clock to complete LSTs that would carry Marines across Pacific beaches they would never see. Families in Detroit built LVT engines while their sons served in the Pacific Fleet, connected to distant battles through the products of their labor. Women who had never worked outside the home before Pearl Harbor were now riveting the hulls of landing craft that would determine the outcome of the war. These workers operated under conditions that reflected both the urgency of wartime production and systematic approaches to complex manufacturing processes. Shipyards maintained quality control standards that exceeded peacetime construction because defective vessels meant casualties on distant battlefields. Safety procedures protected workers whose injuries would delay production schedules measured in ships launched per day. Training programs taught specialized skills to workers who had never built boats before the war. Admiral Minoru Ota, commanding the 5th Air Fleet from his headquarters in southern Kyushu, attempted to coordinate kamikaze attacks against the invasion fleet, but the scale of the target presented impossible choices. With over 1,500 ships spread across 40 kilometers of ocean, Japanese pilots could not concentrate their attacks effectively. Ugaki wrote in his diary, "The enemy has brought such numbers that destroying even 100 ships would not significantly affect their capability. They have made our traditional tactics meaningless through sheer abundance." The first wave of LVTs hit Okinawan beaches at 8:30 a.m. on April 1, 1945. Within 6 hours, 60,000 American troops were ashore with tanks, artillery, and supplies. By the end of the second day, the beachhead extended 15 kilometers inland and included 2 airfields. The speed of the build-up stunned Japanese defenders who had expected days or weeks to organize counterattacks against isolated landing forces. The logistics behind this achievement revealed American industrial capacity in its full magnitude. Each of the 4 assault divisions required approximately 1,000 tons of supplies daily. The invasion fleet delivered this material continuously through a carefully orchestrated system of landing craft rotation. Empty vessels returned to supply ships offshore, while loaded craft maintained a constant stream of men and material flowing across the beaches. LSTs beached themselves at high tide and discharged cargo, while waiting for the next tide cycle. LCTs shuttled between larger ships and the beach, carrying everything from ammunition to medical supplies. DUKWs, the amphibious trucks known as ducks, drove directly from ships through the surf to supply dumps inland. The Americans had created a supply system that delivered more material across hostile beaches than most ports could handle in peacetime. Japanese attempts to disrupt this supply system proved futile. Artillery positioned in the island's limestone caves could target individual landing craft, but destroying a few vessels among thousands had no meaningful impact. Kamikaze attacks sank several LSTs, but could not significantly reduce the flow of supplies. For every vessel lost, 3 more appeared to take its place. The psychological effect on Japanese forces was as devastating as the material impact. Soldiers who had been told that American industrial capacity was exaggerated could see with their own eyes the endless stream of landing craft, delivering troops and supplies. The spiritual strength that Japanese military doctrine emphasized seemed meaningless against an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. Captain Tsuneo Shimura, commanding a coastal defense battery on the southern tip of Okinawa, wrote in his final report before the position was overrun, "The enemy possesses so many ships and landing boats that destroying them is like trying to stop the rain by shooting at individual raindrops. Our entire strategy was based on defeating an enemy similar to ourselves in numbers and capability. We are instead fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity has made traditional warfare obsolete." By April 4, 1945, over 180,000 American troops were ashore on Okinawa, with complete equipment and 30 days of supplies. The speed of this build-up had made Japanese defensive plans irrelevant. Instead of facing isolated American landing forces that could be defeated piecemeal, Japanese defenders confronted a fully equipped army that grew stronger each day. The industrial achievement represented by the Okinawa landing craft deployment extended far beyond military significance. American shipyards had demonstrated the capacity to build specialized vessels in numbers that transformed amphibious warfare from a risky gamble into a routine operation. Workers in dozens of cities across America had built the instruments of victory while never seeing the beaches where their products would prove decisive. The human dimension of this achievement deserves recognition. Welders in New Orleans shipyards worked around the clock to complete LSTs that would carry Marines across Pacific beaches. Families in Detroit built LVT engines while their sons served in the Pacific Fleet. Women who had never worked outside the home before Pearl Harbor were now riveting the hulls of landing craft that would determine the outcome of the war. The contrast with Japanese production capabilities was stark and decisive. While American shipyards launched new landing craft daily, Japanese facilities struggled to maintain existing vessels. Lack of raw materials, skilled workers, and industrial capacity meant that landing craft damaged in combat often could not be repaired or replaced. The Americans faced the opposite problem, possessing more landing craft than they could effectively employ in single operations. This abundance of landing craft fundamentally changed American strategic options. With sufficient amphibious capability to mount multiple major operations simultaneously, American commanders could threaten Japanese positions throughout the Pacific. The Japanese were forced to defend every possible landing site rather than concentrating forces against likely targets. This dispersal of defensive effort made every Japanese position weaker and every American assault more likely to succeed. The battle for Okinawa would continue for 82 days, becoming the bloodiest Pacific campaign of the war. But the outcome was determined in those first 72 hours, when 3,000 American landing craft delivered an invasion force larger than many nations' entire armies. Japanese defenders fought with characteristic determination and skill, but they were fighting against American industrial capacity made manifest in steel and determination. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The broader implications of the Okinawa landing extended far beyond the immediate military situation. American industrial mobilization had created capabilities that made traditional concepts of military balance obsolete. When one side could build landing craft faster than the enemy and could sink them, amphibious warfare became a tool of strategic dominance rather than tactical opportunity. Japanese military leaders began to understand the full implications of American industrial might only as they witnessed its effects on Okinawan beaches. Admiral Ugaki wrote in his diary on April 5, "The enemy's capacity to deliver such massive forces so quickly makes our defensive strategy meaningless. We prepared to fight an invasion. Instead, we face an industrial system that has made invasion routine." The psychological impact was as devastating as the material reality. The technical sophistication behind the landing craft deployment revealed systematic American approaches to complex logistical problems. Each vessel type was designed for specific roles within an integrated system. LSTs provided heavy lift capability for tanks and artillery. LCIs delivered assault troops quickly and efficiently. LVTs crossed reefs and continued inland to attack defensive positions. DUKWs maintained supply lines between ships and shore. No single vessel was decisive, but together they created unprecedented amphibious capability. American commanders had learned to treat landing craft as expendable assets rather than precious resources. Unlike Japanese doctrine that emphasized preserving equipment, American planning assumed that some vessels would be lost and incorporated replacement schedules into operational planning. This psychological difference reflected broader contrasts in industrial philosophy. American abundance allowed acceptance of losses that would have been catastrophic for Japanese forces. The training programs that prepared American crews for landing craft operations demonstrated systematic approaches to complex military problems. Specialized schools taught coxswains to navigate surf conditions and beach landing craft under fire. Engineers learned to repair damaged vessels using standardized parts and procedures. Medical personnel practiced evacuation procedures using landing craft as ambulances. The Americans had systematized every aspect of amphibious warfare. Japanese observers noted the efficiency of American supply operations with growing dismay. Landing craft delivered ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment in carefully coordinated schedules. Empty vessels immediately returned to supply ships for new loads. The continuous cycle meant that American forces ashore never lacked essential supplies despite being thousands of kilometers from the nearest major base. The impact on Japanese morale was cumulative and devastating. Soldiers who had been told that American forces were poorly trained and equipped could see the opposite with their own eyes. The endless stream of landing craft delivering fresh troops and supplies convinced many Japanese defenders that resistance was futile. Some units began surrendering rather than fighting to the death as doctrine demanded. Private Kojo wrote in his diary on April 8, "Today I counted over 50 enemy landing boats in just 1 hour passing our position. Each boat carries 20 or 30 soldiers with complete equipment. In 1 hour, more than 1,000 enemy soldiers landed while we lost 10 men to their artillery. At this rate, they will soon have more soldiers on Okinawa than we do. How can spirit overcome such numbers?" The strategic implications extended to the planned invasion of Japan itself. American commanders realized that the landing craft production capacity demonstrated at Okinawa could support even larger operations against the Japanese mainland. Planning for Operation Downfall incorporated assumptions about amphibious capability that had been proven feasible on Okinawan beaches. The Japanese faced the prospect of defending their home islands against invasion forces even larger than the one overwhelming Okinawa. Japanese attempts to develop countermeasures proved inadequate against the scale of American amphibious capability. Suicide boats designed to attack landing craft achieved limited success, but could not significantly reduce the flow of troops and supplies. Artillery positions that had been carefully sited to destroy landing forces found their fields of fire overwhelmed by targets too numerous to engage effectively. The kamikaze campaign against the Okinawa invasion fleet reflected Japanese desperation in the face of overwhelming American material superiority. Between April 6 and June 22, Japanese pilots flew over 1,500 suicide sorties against the invasion fleet. They sank 36 American vessels and damaged 368 others. But these losses represented less than 10% of the total American force, and replacement vessels continued to arrive throughout the campaign. Admiral Turner reported to Pacific Fleet Headquarters that landing craft losses at Okinawa were within acceptable parameters and did not affect operational capability. This statement would have been impossible during earlier Pacific campaigns, when each landing craft was precious and losses directly impacted mission success. By 1945, American production had made landing craft sufficiently abundant that tactical losses became manageable rather than catastrophic. The industrial achievement represented by the Okinawa landing craft deployment influenced post-war military planning and civilian applications. Lessons learned in mass production of specialized vessels informed commercial shipbuilding for decades. Techniques developed for landing craft construction were adapted for offshore oil platforms, military transport vessels, and civilian ferries. The systematic approach to amphibious warfare became a model for complex logistical operations in civilian industries. The human cost of this industrial achievement deserves acknowledgement alongside its strategic significance. Shipyard workers who built landing craft often worked 60-hour weeks under dangerous conditions. Industrial accidents killed hundreds of workers in facilities producing vessels for Pacific operations. Families sacrificed normal lives to support war production that would determine the fate of sons and husbands serving in the Pacific Fleet. The contrast between American and Japanese industrial philosophies became apparent in post-war analyses of the Okinawa campaign. American emphasis on standardization, mass production, and material abundance had created military capabilities that Japanese traditional approaches could not match. Quality craftsmanship and spiritual dedication proved insufficient against an enemy that could build tools of war faster than they could be destroyed. Japanese post-war studies concluded that their fundamental error lay in misunderstanding the nature of modern industrial warfare. Admiral Toyoda wrote in his memoirs, "We prepared to fight a traditional naval war between roughly equal forces. Instead, we faced an industrial system that had made traditional concepts of military balance obsolete. The Americans did not defeat us through superior tactics or individual courage. They buried us under manufactured steel." The psychological transformation in Japanese strategic thinking was complete by the end of the Okinawa campaign. Military leaders, who had believed in eventual victory through superior fighting spirit, now understood that American industrial capacity made continued resistance futile. The endless stream of landing craft delivering fresh troops and supplies to Okinawan beaches had demonstrated capabilities that no amount of traditional military virtue could overcome. The legacy of the Okinawa landing craft deployment extends into modern military doctrine and civilian applications. Current amphibious warfare concepts still reflect lessons learned about the decisive importance of adequate shipping and systematic supply procedures. Military logistics planning continues to emphasize redundancy and abundance rather than efficiency and economy when preparing for major operations. The technical innovations developed for Pacific landing craft influenced post-war developments in civilian transportation and offshore operations. Design principles proven in combat informed construction of ferries, offshore platforms, and specialized transport vessels. The systematic approach to amphibious operations became a model for complex civilian projects, requiring coordination of multiple specialized components. Admiral Nimitz summarized the significance of American landing craft production in his final report to the Secretary of the Navy. The decisive factor in Pacific operations was not any single weapon or tactic, but the industrial capacity that provided tools of war in abundance. Landing craft production enabled amphibious operations on a scale that made traditional defensive strategies obsolete. The enemy's finest soldiers and most determined resistance proved insufficient against American shipyards. The story of the 3,000 landing craft that appeared at Okinawa in 72 hours represents more than military history. It demonstrates how industrial capacity can transform strategic realities and make traditional military wisdom obsolete. Japanese admirals who had planned to defend Okinawa through skillful tactics and fanatical resistance found themselves overwhelmed by American manufacturing, made manifest in steel and determination. The final accounting was decisive and irreversible. American shipyards had built the instruments of victory, while Japanese defenders could only watch helplessly as overwhelming force materialized on their beaches. The landing craft that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as numerically impossible became the tools that made Japanese defeat inevitable. In the arithmetic of modern warfare, quantity had achieved its own quality through the systematic application of industrial might. The transformation from the confident Japanese defensive planning of early 1945 to the desperate kamikaze attacks of the spring demonstrated how quickly industrial superiority could render traditional military strategies obsolete. The admirals, who had never expected 3,000 landing craft to appear at Okinawa, learned that American shipyards had made the impossible routine. Today, the beaches of Okinawa remain peaceful, but the lessons of April 1945 continue to influence military thinking worldwide. The campaign demonstrated that in modern warfare, victory often belongs not to the side with better tactics or braver soldiers, but to the nation with superior industrial capacity. The 3,000 landing craft that shocked Japanese defenders represented American manufacturing power unleashed, proving that sufficient abundance could overcome any defense. The story of Okinawa's landing craft deployment stands as a testament to industrial mobilization and systematic planning. Workers in distant shipyards had built the tools of victory while Japanese defenders prepared elaborate fortifications that would prove irrelevant against overwhelming material superiority. The collision between traditional military thinking and modern industrial capacity determined not just the outcome at Okinawa, but the entire course of the Pacific War. In the end, Japanese admirals learned what their German counterparts had discovered in the Atlantic: that modern warfare rewards industrial capacity over individual courage, systematic production over traditional craftsmanship, and material abundance over spiritual determination. The 3,000 landing craft that appeared at Okinawa in 72 hours represented this reality made manifest in steel, delivering American victory through the systematic application of manufacturing might that no amount of traditional military virtue could overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your report screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.